Quite a few years ago when I was on sabbatical, I spent 2 weeks. I have a high school classmate, had a cabin right on the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park where she let me stay for a couple weeks. I remember one beautiful late April day, I was out and climbing in the Rockies, and I was up on this peak, and it was beyond gorgeous. It was beautiful. But it didn't feel quite right because there was no one with me. I really felt like saying to somebody that I cared about, loved, wow, look at this. Can you believe this beautiful sight? I missed that, so then I thought, well, I have a cell phone. Maybe I could call, but wouldn't you know, from the peak there was no cell phone service. And so I still remember that because I so wanted to share the beauty with someone, especially with someone I loved. I wanted my wife or my daughters to be there, and I was really bummed out when there was no cell phone service, because that at least would have been second best. And I also remember when I went to Uganda 2008, my first trip. We were going up to northern Uganda where Kony had been for the Civil War for over 20 years. I'd never been to that part of Africa before. I didn't know what to expect. And I was really happy that I was with someone who was an experienced traveler, who had been there before, who could be kind of a guide, so that if situations arose that I was unfamiliar with or frightened by, I would have someone I could rely on. Us human beings are irrevocably social and relational beings, and I think we're that way because God has made us that way. And I believe that at a very deep level, all of us long for God to be with us, this loving God to be with us. I think St. Augustine was right who said in the Confessions, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in Thee. Now, at different points in our lives, or some people may never experience that. It may be disguised as something else. But I really believe that we long for the presence of God. And if there is one thing Christmas is about, and it's one of the most important things, is God's presence. God being with us. When you think of the grand narrative of the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, it's all about the story of God's faithful presence, of God being with us. When God made the creation, when God created, God was with the creation. God created human beings to be with human beings. But unfortunately, human beings usurped God's authority and broke fellowship with Him. And so God's presence with humanity has been disrupted. It's almost like we have filters on and we don't see God. We rush around in a frenetic lifestyle, and we just don't see God. It reminds me of myself in some ways. I am what you might call, I am fashion challenged. You may have noticed. Now, fortunately, I have a wife and 2 daughters who try to hide that from people, but it does come through. I mean, I really don't pay attention to what people wear unless it's incredibly ugly or incredibly bizarre. I won't notice. I mean, you could probably wear the same thing. You wear different things, I would never notice that. In fact, it's so bad that before my older daughter Michelle's wedding, she said, Dad, you're going to buy a new suit. You're not going to be in my wedding with the suit you've been wearing for the last 15 years. So I did. I went and got a new suit. I also don't see dust. My eyes I just don't see dust. It's funny that people come into my office and they see an inch of dust on my desk. They see it and sometimes kindly remind me that maybe dusting would be a good thing. The other problem is I don't care about it either, so if I know it, I don't dust. But there's a way in which these things I just don't see. And I think that's a way in which it's like God's presence. We don't see God's presence. It's kind of filtered out. We have these filters. We've somehow developed cataracts that prevent us from seeing God. But the good news is God is not put off by that, in the sense that God hasn't moved away from us. It's us who are not able to see God's presence in our lives. And so God, after the fall, he ends up calling Abraham and birthing a nation through which he wants to bless the nation and the whole world. He promises to be with Abraham and to be with Israel. When Israel is taken into Egypt and enslaved, and God calls Moses to free his people, Moses is scared out of his mind to go to the Pharaoh and to say, "Let my people go." And so God says to Moses, "I will be with you." And that is a refrain that occurs over and over and over in the whole grand narrative of Scripture. I will be with you. And we see that in other characters in Scripture, whether it's Joseph, whether it's Gideon or Deborah or Samuel or David. I will be with you, God says. And even when Israel is exiled, they've been so disobedient that God exiles them, and they feel like God has abandoned them. God still has not abandoned them. And so through the prophets, God promises to be with them, that God will not abandon them. He promises to renew the broken relationship, forgive people their sins, break the hold of violence, and to be among them. God will heal Israel and the world through his faithful presence. Which brings us to Jesus. At the Annunciation that occurs earlier in Luke, where the angel announces to Mary, the very first thing that the angel says is, "O favored one, the Lord is with you." That powerful preposition. The Lord is with you. And what does Emmanuel mean when he says you're going to bear a son? Emmanuel means God with us. And so in a totally unexpected and remarkable display of faithful presence, God becomes human. And the amazing reality of the living God having come to dwell with us cannot be missed in the presence and the ministry of Jesus. And Jesus is crucified for the world. He's resurrected in power. And before he ascends, he says, "I will be with you always." He says, "Lo, I will be with you always, and I will send my Spirit." So after he ascends, he sends a Spirit, and on that first Pentecost Sunday, the Spirit comes to be Jesus' presence, and he forms the church. And the book of Revelation says that the goal of all this is that God's faithful presence will be restored. God will make everything new and right. And God will flood the world. God's presence will flood the world. We live in a culture that increasingly doesn't see God. And if something happens, it's always rationalized away. I recently read, actually this morning I read in an article that the amount of adults that experience loneliness has doubled since the 1980s. In the mid-1980s, the number of adults that said that was 20%. Recently, a study showed that now 40% of adults feel lonely. That's a huge number. But our God is a God who is with us. And our God is with us not only when things are going well, or we feel like things are going well, but God promises to be with us no matter what our condition. God promises to be with us in our weakness. God promises to be with us in our doubts. God promises to be with us even in our suffering. Christian Wyman, a poet and author who is struggling with cancer, writes that God is there. God isn't beyond suffering. God is with us in our suffering. And so this evening, as we celebrate the incarnation, the faithful presence of God, God with us, that powerful preposition, God with us, we rejoice and celebrate this God who says, "Lo, I will be with you always. I will never abandon you. I will never forsake you. I will be with you through thick and thin." Amen.